Most people believe they are simply describing their lives when they speak about themselves. I'm tired. I'm stressed. I'm unlucky. I'm not where I want to be yet. It sounds harmless, just observations, just honest self-talk. But what if those statements are not neutral at all? What if they're not descriptions, but instructions? Because there's something fascinating happening beneath the surface of identity, something both neuroscience and quantum theory hint at in different ways. The way you identify yourself doesn't just reflect your reality. It actively participates in shaping how you perceive, respond to, and ultimately experience it. And among all identity statements, two words stand above the rest: I am. Anything that follows those words tends to solidify into a reference point for your brain, your behavior, and even your emotional baseline. Not instantly, not magically, but consistently. Think about it this way. Your mind works like a prediction engine. It constantly filters reality to confirm what it already assumes to be true about you. If the assumption is, I am overwhelmed, your perception highlights stress. If it's, I am capable, the same situations start looking like opportunities. This isn't mystical exaggeration, it's cognitive filtering. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In physics, particularly in discussions about observation and systems behavior, the observer is never completely separate from what's observed. Measurement changes interaction. Attention alters outcomes. Not in a supernatural way, but in a participatory one. And identity works similarly. The version of yourself you repeatedly recognize becomes the version your nervous system stabilizes around. Your posture, tone, decisions, risk tolerance, emotional resilience, all begin aligning with that internal reference. That's why ancient traditions emphasized identity statements long before modern psychology existed. And why contemporary research on neuroplasticity suggests that consistent self-identification can gradually rewire perception and behavior. So this video isn't about affirmations. It's not about pretending. And it's definitely not about forcing positivity. It's about understanding how identity functions as a frequency stabilizer, psychologically, emotionally, and energetically, and how becoming conscious of your I am changes the way reality organizes around you. Because once you see this mechanism clearly, something shifts. You stop reacting to life only as it appears, and you start participating in how it unfolds. And that's where the real exploration begins. Once you start paying attention to identity language, you notice something subtle but powerful. People rarely question what comes after the words, I am. They treat those statements as facts rather than interpretations. I am bad with money. I am not confident. I am always anxious. These phrases often originate from temporary experiences, but when repeated, the brain stops treating them as situational and starts treating them as structural. They become part of self-definition, and self-definition has consequences. From a neuroscience perspective, identity influences behavioral consistency. The brain prefers coherence. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, your choices, often unconsciously, begin aligning with that expectation. Not because you want to fail, but because stability feels safer than unpredictability. Psychologists sometimes call this identity-based behavior. You don't just act randomly, you act in ways that confirm who you believe you are. But there's another layer here that goes beyond psychology alone. Your identity also shapes perception. Two people can enter the same situation with completely different internal I am statements. One sees threat, another sees possibility. One feels judged, another feels curious. The external event hasn't changed, but the internal filter has. And perception influences response. Response influences outcome. Outcome reinforces identity. That loop can either stabilize limitation or expansion. Now, when we talk about frequency in the quantum portal context, we're not talking about something mystical floating in space. We're talking about patterns, emotional, cognitive, physiological. that repeat consistently enough to become your baseline state. Your I am acts like a stabilizer for that baseline. If your internal identity is chaotic, your nervous system fluctuates more. Decisions become reactive. Energy disperses. But when identity stabilizes, when there's internal coherence, behavior becomes more predictable, calmer, more directed. This is one reason high performers across different fields often share a similar internal narrative. Athletes, entrepreneurs, artists, researchers, they may use different language, but there's usually a strong underlying identity, capable, adaptable, resilient. Not perfect, but stable. And stability reduces internal friction. You stop negotiating with yourself constantly. You spend less energy doubting basic decisions. Emotional recovery becomes faster because the core identity isn't threatened by temporary setbacks. So the real question isn't, what do you want? It's, who are you being while you pursue it? Because desire without aligned identity often creates tension, but identity aligned with direction tends to generate momentum naturally. And once you understand that, the conversation about manifestation changes completely. It becomes less about attracting something new, and more about stabilizing who you already choose to be. And that leads us to the deeper intersection between ancient identity teachings and modern scientific understanding, which is where this discussion becomes even more fascinating. Long before neuroscience, psychology, or quantum theory existed, ancient traditions were already pointing to something remarkably similar. Identity comes first, experience follows. Different cultures expressed it differently. Some spoke of essence, others of spirit, others of consciousness. But many converged on a simple idea, that how you define yourself influences how reality organizes around you. The famous declaration, "I am that I am," for example, isn't just religious poetry. At a symbolic level, it reflects self-definition without external validation, identity as origin rather than consequence. Fast forward to modern science, and we see parallel ideas emerging, not identical, but intriguingly aligned. In neuroscience, self-concept shapes neural pathways. When you repeatedly identify in a certain way, your brain reinforces circuits consistent with that identity. Attention narrows, behavioral tendencies stabilize, emotional responses become predictable. This isn't instant transformation, it's gradual conditioning. And then there's perception science. The brain doesn't passively record reality. It predicts it. It filters massive amounts of information through prior beliefs, expectations, and identity markers. In practical terms, you often see what you're prepared to see. If your identity includes "I am overlooked," you'll notice signals confirming that. If it includes "I am impactful," the same environment starts offering different cues. Same world, different interface. Now, when people bring quantum physics into this conversation, it's important to stay grounded. Quantum theory doesn't say thoughts magically create reality, but it does demonstrate something fascinating. Observation affects systems. Measurement changes interaction. Participation influences outcome. Not because of wishful thinking, but because observer and system are interconnected at certain levels. And metaphorically, identity functions similarly in daily life. You are not separate from the reality you experience. Your interpretation, emotional state, expectations, and identity all shape how situations unfold behaviorally, relationally, and psychologically. This is where the quantum portal perspective sits. Not extreme mysticism, not rigid materialism. Instead, an integrative view. Identity influences perception. Perception influences action. Action influences environment. Environment feeds back into identity. A dynamic loop. And when that loop becomes conscious, something powerful happens. You stop waiting for external evidence to validate who you are. Instead, identity becomes a stabilizing reference point from which experience evolves, not denial of reality, not forced positivity, but conscious participation. Because once identity stabilizes internally, the nervous system relaxes, decision-making clarifies, emotional resilience increases, and gradually, external patterns begin reflecting that internal coherence. Which brings us to a crucial turning point in this discussion. Most people aren't using identity intentionally. They're inheriting it from past experiences. And that unconscious inheritance is often what keeps patterns repeating, even when someone genuinely wants change. That's exactly what we're going to unpack next. Here's where most people get stuck. Not because they lack potential, intelligence, or even motivation, but because their identity is running on autopilot. And autopilot identities are almost always built from the past. Experiences accumulate. Feedback from family, school, relationships, work, moments of success, moments of rejection. Over time, the brain compresses those experiences into simple identity shortcuts. I'm not good at this. I always struggle with that. I guess this is just how I am. It feels factual, but often it's just familiar. The nervous system prefers familiarity over possibility because familiarity feels safe, even when it limits you. This is why people sometimes unconsciously maintain situations they consciously say they want to change, not out of weakness, but out of identity consistency. The brain protects coherence before it pursues expansion. And this is where unconscious "I am" statements quietly shape reality. They influence posture before you speak, tone before you finish a sentence, decisions before you consciously evaluate options. They even influence what opportunities you notice or overlook entirely. Psychology calls part of this confirmation bias. You filter for evidence that validates your existing identity, not intentionally, automatically. So if the internal narrative says "I am unlucky," small setbacks stand out more. Positive signals fade into background noise. Over time, perception itself reinforces the identity, and once perception shifts, behavior follows. You might hesitate slightly more, speak a little less assertively, take fewer calculated risks, interpret neutral feedback as criticism. None of this feels dramatic in isolation, but cumulatively, it shapes life trajectory. From a quantum portal perspective, this is often described metaphorically as frequency stabilization, not mystical vibration in a literal sense, but a stable psychological emotional pattern that keeps reproducing similar outcomes. And here's the important part. This isn't punishment. It's not bad luck. It's not the universe working against you. It's pattern continuity. Systems, biological, psychological, even social, tend toward stability. Once an identity becomes dominant, it subtly organizes perception, energy, and behavior to maintain itself. That's why simply changing actions rarely produces lasting change. New habits layered over an unchanged identity tend to revert under stress. The deeper reference point remains untouched. So the real shift begins not with forcing new behaviors, but with gently questioning inherited identity, not fighting it, not shaming it, just noticing it. Because awareness introduces flexibility, and flexibility is the first crack through which new identity can emerge. And once identity becomes flexible, something else becomes possible. You can choose it, not overnight, not perfectly, but intentionally. And that choice, sustained over time, is what gradually moves someone from reaction to authorship. That's exactly where we're heading next. At some point, a subtle but profound realization begins to emerge. Most people wait for external proof before allowing themselves to adopt a new identity. They think, when I succeed, then I'll feel confident. When I have stability, then I'll feel secure. When things improve, then I'll see myself differently. It sounds logical, but psychologically, and even behaviorally, it often works in reverse. Identity tends to precede sustained change. Not because imagination magically alters reality, but because identity influences perception, decision-making, emotional regulation, and consistency of action. And those factors compound over time into visible results. Think about someone who identifies as resilient. That person still faces setbacks. Nothing about reality suddenly becomes easier, but their response pattern changes. Recovery time shortens. Interpretation shifts. Effort stabilizes. And over time, those subtle differences accumulate into very tangible outcomes. This is why waiting for proof before adjusting identity can keep people in prolonged cycles of hesitation. The external evidence they're waiting for often requires the internal shift first. From a systems perspective, identity acts like a stabilizing reference point. It tells your nervous system what's normal, what's safe, what's expected. If success feels unfamiliar at an identity level, even positive changes can trigger subtle resistance. Not sabotage in a dramatic sense, just friction, hesitation where there could be momentum, self-doubt where there could be clarity, delay where there could be flow. And because this happens gradually, most people attribute it to circumstances rather than identity. But once you begin exploring identity consciously, something interesting happens. You stop asking, "How do I get this outcome?" And start asking, "Who am I being while I move toward it?" That question changes behavior immediately. Posture shifts, tone stabilizes, decisions become slightly more aligned with long-term direction rather than short-term comfort. And these micro-adjustments are powerful precisely because they're sustainable. They don't require constant motivation. They emerge naturally from identity coherence. In the quantum portal framework, this is sometimes described as alignment, not perfection. Not constant high emotion, just internal consistency. When identity, intention, and behavior stop contradicting each other, energy stops leaking through internal conflict. You become more efficient psychologically, and efficiency accelerates outcomes. This doesn't mean denying present reality. It means recognizing that present reality often reflects previous identity states. Treating it as final data can freeze growth. Treating it as evolving feedback keeps identity flexible. So instead of waiting for life to prove something to you, you begin quietly proving something to yourself first, not loudly, not forcefully, but consistently. And that consistency is exactly what allows a new baseline identity to stabilize, which is what we'll explore next. At some point in this journey of identity awareness, a concept often emerges, sometimes called the God state. And before any misunderstanding arises, it's important to clarify what this really points to. It's not ego. It's not superiority, and it's definitely not the idea of controlling reality. At its most grounded level, what people refer to as the God state is simply internal coherence, a condition where your thoughts, emotions, body responses, and self-perception are no longer contradicting each other, because contradiction drains energy. When one part of you says, "I'm capable," but another part quietly says, "I don't believe that," tension arises. That tension doesn't just stay mental, it shows up physiologically. Slight muscle contraction, shallow breathing, hesitation in speech, micro delays in decision-making. None of this is dramatic, but collectively, it affects presence. Coherence, on the other hand, simplifies things. You think something, you emotionally accept it. Your body relaxes into it. Your actions reflect it. That alignment creates stability. Neuroscience touches on this through concepts like self-directed neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on repeated patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. When these patterns align consistently, neural pathways strengthen faster. Your system becomes more efficient. There's also growing research around heart-brain coherence, how emotional regulation influences cognitive clarity, stress response, and overall resilience. When emotional and cognitive signals synchronize, people tend to experience greater calm, focus, and adaptability. Again, nothing mystical, but very powerful. From the quantum portal perspective, this coherence is what allows identity to stabilize beyond temporary motivation. Instead of needing constant affirmations or bursts of inspiration, the identity begins operating quietly in the background. It becomes default. And that's when something interesting happens. Effort decreases. Clarity increases. Reactivity softens. Not because challenges disappear, but because internal friction reduces. This is often why some people appear naturally confident or grounded. They're not constantly negotiating with themselves. Their internal signals are relatively aligned, and coherence has a ripple effect. When your internal state stabilizes, interactions become smoother, communication becomes clearer, decision-making speeds up, emotional recovery improves. Over time, these subtle shifts change how environments respond to you, professionally, socially, even creatively, not magically, systemically. So when we talk about entering a more aligned identity state, we're really talking about reducing internal contradiction, about letting your chosen identity move from intellectual concept to emotional acceptance, to embodied baseline. And once that baseline stabilizes, maintaining it becomes far easier than constantly trying to recreate it. Which leads us to the next crucial piece. How do you actually shift identity gradually, without forcing it, faking it, or triggering internal resistance? That's where the real practical work begins. One of the biggest misconceptions about identity change is the idea that it has to be dramatic, that you wake up one day, decide who you want to be, and everything shifts instantly. That rarely happens. Identity tends to evolve through repetition, emotional safety, and gradual consistency. And when people try to jump too far too fast, forcing themselves to believe something their nervous system doesn't yet accept, resistance often increases instead of decreasing. This is why subtle shifts are usually more powerful than extreme ones. For example, if someone has spent years thinking, "I'm always exhausted," jumping immediately to, "I am endlessly energetic," might feel artificial. The brain flags the mismatch. Skepticism kicks in. The affirmation loses stability. But a transitional identity works differently. Something like, "I am learning to restore my energy. I am becoming more balanced. I am building sustainable strength." These statements don't deny current experience. They introduce direction, and direction reduces internal conflict. Psychologically, this aligns with cognitive reframing. Instead of suppressing old identity patterns, you gently redirect them. Over time, repetition stabilizes the new narrative until it feels familiar. And familiarity is what the nervous system ultimately trusts. There's also a behavioral dimension. Identity isn't just declared, it's reinforced through microactions. Small, consistent behaviors tell the brain, "This is who we are now." And those behaviors don't have to be dramatic. Showing up slightly more prepared, speaking a bit more deliberately, choosing rest instead of burnout, making one aligned decision per day. These micro-signals accumulate, and because they're manageable, they don't trigger overwhelm. Consistency becomes sustainable. Sustainability allows identity to root. From a physiological perspective, emotional safety is key here. If your system associates change with threat, even positive change, it may unconsciously revert to familiar patterns, not sabotage, self-protection. So gradual identity expansion helps regulate that response. You're not abandoning who you were, you're updating it. And the interesting thing is that once the new identity starts stabilizing, motivation becomes less necessary. Behavior flows more naturally. Effort shifts from pushing to maintaining. This is often when people notice something subtle but meaningful. They don't have to remind themselves as much. They don't argue internally as often. They simply act from a slightly different baseline. That baseline is what eventually reshapes outcomes. Not overnight, not perfectly, but reliably. And once identity change feels safe, once your system trusts it, there's another layer that becomes possible. Bringing the body fully into alignment with the new identity. Because identity isn't just cognitive, it's physiological too. That's exactly where we're heading next. There's a layer of identity that most people overlook. You can think differently. You can speak differently. You can even act differently for a while. But if your body still feels unsafe inside the new identity, it won't stabilize. This is where many identity shifts collapse, because identity is not just cognitive, it's neurological and physiological. Your nervous system stores emotional memory. If past experiences linked success with pressure, visibility with criticism, abundance with instability, or love with disappointment, your body may associate expansion with danger. And when the body senses danger, it contracts. That contraction shows up subtly. Tightened breath, guarded posture, hesitation, hypervigilance, overthinking. Even if your mind says, "I am confident," your physiology might still whisper, "Stay small." This mismatch creates incoherence, and incoherence disperses energy. Research in psychophysiology shows that emotional regulation influences cognitive performance. When the nervous system is calm, perception broadens. Decision-making improves. Creativity increases. Social confidence rises. But when the system is dysregulated, identity destabilizes. So if you want identity to become baseline, not temporary motivation, your body must feel safe inside it. This doesn't require complex rituals. It requires congruence. If your new identity is "I am capable," your body posture needs to reflect it. Shoulders relaxed but open, breath steady, voice grounded. These signals tell the brain, this state is safe. If your identity is "I am abundant," but your body is constantly tense and bracing for loss, the signal remains mixed. The shift happens when thought, emotion, and physiology align. That's coherence. And coherence has a compounding effect. The more your body experiences safety inside the new identity, the less resistance arises. The less resistance arises, the more consistently you act from that identity. The more consistently you act, the faster external feedback begins reflecting it. Not because the universe is being commanded, but because your perception, energy, and behavior are no longer contradicting each other. This is often where people describe feeling locked in, not hyped, not euphoric, but stable. Calm confidence, grounded presence, reduced internal noise. And once identity stabilizes physiologically, something powerful happens. You stop chasing results for reassurance. You begin moving from quiet certainty. That certainty is what turns identity from an experiment into a residence. And when identity becomes residence, reality starts reorganizing around a new center of gravity, which leads us to the next phase: how to stabilize this state so it doesn't flicker, but becomes your default setting. This is the stage most people underestimate. They experience a moment of clarity, maybe even a powerful internal shift. For a few hours, sometimes a few days, they feel aligned, focused, certain. And then life happens. Stress returns. Old environments reactivate familiar responses. Internal dialogue slips back into older identity patterns. Not because the shift wasn't real, but because it wasn't yet stabilized. Identity doesn't become baseline through intensity. It becomes baseline through consistency. This is true neurologically, emotionally, and behaviorally. Repetition signals safety to the brain. Familiarity lowers resistance. And over time, what once required effort becomes automatic. Think about any skill you've mastered. At first, it demanded attention. Later, it became second nature. Identity formation works the same way. The key is gentle persistence, not forcing yourself to feel a certain way, not pretending everything is perfect, but repeatedly returning to the identity you've consciously chosen. Sometimes that return is subtle: a breath before reacting, a posture adjustment before speaking, a quieter internal correction when old narratives surface. These micro-adjustments may seem insignificant, but cumulatively, they train your nervous system toward stability, and stability reduces oscillation. Oscillation is what keeps many people stuck, swinging between confidence and doubt, clarity and confusion, expansion and contraction. The external world then reflects that instability, inconsistent results, unpredictable momentum. But when internal frequency stabilizes, behavior becomes steadier, communication clearer, decision-making less reactive. Over time, environments begin responding differently, not dramatically at first, often subtly. Conversations shift. Opportunities appear less forced. Timing improves. Energy expenditure decreases. From a systems perspective, coherence attracts coherence. Stable signals interact more efficiently with other stable systems. This isn't mystical attraction, it's compatibility. And compatibility reduces friction. Eventually, something very quiet happens. You stop checking constantly whether it's working. You stop needing reassurance. Identity becomes self-evident. You don't wake up thinking, I need to become this today. You wake up already moving from it. That's stabilization. And once stabilization happens, a natural byproduct emerges. External manifestations begin appearing not as dramatic miracles, but as logical extensions of who you consistently are. That transition, from effortful creation to natural expression, is what we're stepping into next. Something interesting tends to happen once identity stabilizes. You stop trying so hard to make things happen. And yet, things begin happening with less resistance. Not instantly, not perfectly, but noticeably. This is often where people describe manifestation. Though in grounded terms, it's less about attracting something magical and more about reducing internal contradiction. When your identity stabilizes, perception sharpens. You notice opportunities earlier. You interpret challenges more constructively. You communicate with more clarity. Decisions align more naturally with long-term direction, and those factors compound. Think of it as behavioral resonance rather than mystical attraction. Your internal state influences how you show up, and how you show up influences how environments respond. A calm, coherent person tends to generate calmer interactions. Someone who trusts their own capability often receives more trust externally. Not because reality is bending, but because signals are clearer. Clarity invites cooperation, and cooperation accelerates results. Another shift happens internally as well. Emotional reactivity decreases. Situations that once triggered anxiety, defensiveness, or hesitation begin feeling more manageable. That emotional stability allows sustained action, and sustained action is where most meaningful outcomes originate. From a physiological perspective, reduced stress improves cognitive function. Attention widens, creativity increases, problem-solving becomes more flexible. All of that supports better external results over time. So manifestation, in this framework, isn't forcing reality. It's allowing reality to align with a stabilized internal reference. You're not chasing outcomes constantly. You're expressing identity consistently. And consistency is persuasive to your nervous system, to your environment, and to the people around you. This is why external changes often arrive quietly. A conversation opens unexpectedly. An idea lands at the right time. A relationship becomes smoother. A professional opportunity appears less forced. They don't feel like miracles. They feel natural, logical extensions of who you've become. And when that realization settles, motivation shifts again. You're no longer acting to prove something. You're acting from coherence, from continuity. That continuity is what gradually transforms lifestyle, relationships, creativity, even health patterns. But there's an important final step in this journey. Making this identity not something you occasionally access, but somewhere you consistently live. That's where true stability and long-term transformation happens. There comes a moment in this journey when identity stops feeling like something you're trying to reach and starts feeling like somewhere you already live. And that changes everything. Because when identity is temporary, you constantly check it, you monitor it, you question whether it's working, you look for proof. That monitoring creates subtle tension, a sense that stability is fragile. But when identity becomes residence, that tension fades. You don't wake up asking, "Can I maintain this today?" You wake up already aligned. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Challenges still happen. Uncertainty still exists. But your baseline response changes. Instead of destabilizing you, events become information, feedback, adjustment points. That shift reduces oscillation.